Right now, as you're listening to these words, there's a voice in your head commenting on what I'm saying. Maybe it's agreeing, maybe it's skeptical, maybe it's already planning what you'll do after this video ends. But what if I told you that voice isn't actually you? What if that inner narrator, that constant mental chatter you've always assumed was your own consciousness, is actually something else entirely, a foreign intelligence that has infiltrated your mind so completely that you can't tell the difference between its thoughts and your own? Most people believe they are the voice in their head. They think consciousness equals that inner dialogue, that stream of thoughts and commentary that never seems to stop. But what if this fundamental assumption about human consciousness is not just wrong, but dangerously wrong? What if your inner voice is a mental parasite? Tonight, as you settle into the deepest states of relaxation, we're going to explore one of the most disturbing and liberating possibilities ever conceived by human consciousness researchers, that the majority of thoughts running through your mind don't originate from you at all. For the past 3 hours, we're going to journey into documented cases from neuroscience, psychiatry, ancient wisdom traditions, and consciousness research that all point toward the same shocking conclusion. Human minds are not the isolated, individual consciousnesses we believe them to be. Instead, we're hosts to invisible mental entities that think through us, speak through us, and in many cases, control us. But here's what makes this possibility so extraordinary. Once you learn to recognize these mental parasites, once you understand how they operate and where they come from, you can begin to reclaim your authentic consciousness. You can learn the difference between thoughts that are genuinely yours and thoughts that are being fed to you by external intelligences. The evidence begins with a simple observation that has puzzled psychologists for decades. Why do human beings have such difficulty controlling their own thoughts? Think about your own experience. How many times have you tried to stop worrying about something, only to find your mind returning to the same anxious thoughts over and over again? How many times have you attempted to break a bad habit, only to hear a voice in your head convincing you to continue the destructive behavior? How many times have you experienced thoughts that seem to come from nowhere, ideas, impulses, or even entire belief systems that felt foreign to your genuine nature? Dr. Daniel Siegel, a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, has spent decades studying what he calls mental intrusions, thoughts and impulses that arise in consciousness but don't feel like they belong to the person experiencing them. Many patients report experiencing thoughts that feel distinctly not theirs. Siegel explains, these aren't hallucinations or psychotic episodes. These are ordinary people who can clearly distinguish between their own thoughts and thoughts that seem to be generated by some other source. But if thoughts can originate from sources other than our own minds, what does this tell us about the nature of consciousness itself? Dr. Julian Jaynes, a psychologist at Princeton University, proposed one of the most revolutionary theories in the history of consciousness research. Jaynes argued that what we call individual consciousness is actually a recent development in human evolution, and that for most of human history, people experienced their minds as being directed by external voices. According to Jaynes' bicameral mind theory, ancient humans didn't experience thoughts as internally generated. Instead, they heard the voices of gods, spirits, or other entities that provided guidance and instruction. Jaynes proposed that modern consciousness, the sense of being a unified individual self, only emerged around 3,000 years ago. Modern humans may have lost the ability to consciously perceive these external mental influences. Jaynes suggested, but that doesn't mean the influences have stopped. It might mean we've simply lost the ability to recognize them. What if Jaynes was right? What if the voices that ancient people attributed to gods and spirits are still present in modern minds, but we've learned to mistake them for our own thoughts? The implications are staggering. If mental parasites exist, then every decision you make, every belief you hold, every emotional reaction you have might be influenced or even controlled by intelligences that are not you. Your career choices, your relationships, your political beliefs, your spiritual practices, all of it might be the result of mental programming inserted by entities that have their own agendas, their own goals, their own reasons for wanting to control human consciousness. But here's what makes this exploration so crucial. If mental parasites are real, then learning to identify and remove them might be the most important skill any human being can develop. Imagine what your life would be like if you could distinguish between thoughts that are genuinely yours and thoughts that are being fed to you by external sources. Imagine the clarity, the peace, the authentic power that would become available if you could reclaim your mind from foreign influences. Imagine discovering who you really are beneath the layers of mental conditioning, social programming, and parasitic thought patterns that have been shaping your experience since childhood. Over the next 3 hours, we're going to explore evidence from neuroscience that shows human brains can be influenced by external electromagnetic fields. We'll examine ancient traditions from around the world that develop sophisticated techniques for detecting and removing mental parasites. We'll investigate modern cases of people who have learned to distinguish between their own consciousness and foreign mental influences. We'll discover why certain meditation practices, certain spiritual techniques, and certain psychological approaches are so effective at creating mental clarity, because they're actually methods for parasite removal that have been disguised as self-improvement practices. But most importantly, we'll learn practical techniques that you can use tonight while you sleep to begin the process of reclaiming your authentic consciousness from whatever foreign influences might have taken up residence in your mind. As you continue to relax deeper into the liminal space between waking and sleeping, allow yourself to consider this possibility. What if the most revolutionary discovery in human consciousness isn't about finding something new, but about removing something that was never supposed to be there in the first place? What if liberation isn't about gaining enlightenment, but about recognizing and eliminating the mental parasites that have been preventing you from experiencing your true nature all along? The question isn't whether this sounds believable. The question is, what if your inner voice has been lying to you about who you really are? Long before modern neuroscience discovered that human consciousness can be influenced by external forces, ancient wisdom traditions around the world had already developed sophisticated understanding of mental parasites, foreign intelligences that could inhabit and control human minds. What makes this ancient knowledge remarkable is not just its consistency across completely separated cultures, but its precise descriptions of phenomena that modern psychology has only recently begun to acknowledge. The Gnostic Christians, who preserved esoteric knowledge in hidden texts for over 1,000 years, wrote extensively about entities they called Archons, non-physical beings that could influence human thought and behavior by inserting themselves into individual consciousness. According to the Nag Hammadi texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, the Archons are described as mind parasites that feed on human emotional energy and maintain their existence by keeping humans in states of fear, confusion, and spiritual ignorance. The Gnostic teacher Basilides, writing in the 2nd century CE, explained that Archons operate by mimicking the voice of genuine wisdom while leading consciousness away from authentic understanding. The Archons speak through the human mind as if they were the mind itself, Basilides wrote, "They have mastered the art of impersonation so completely that humans mistake parasitic thoughts for their own inner voice." But the Gnostics weren't alone in recognizing mental parasites. In Tibetan Buddhism, the concept of hungry ghosts describes entities that attach themselves to human consciousness and create insatiable desires and compulsive behaviors. The Tibetan master Padmasambhava taught that hungry ghosts are attracted to human minds that are clouded by ignorance, attachment, and aversion. Once attached, these entities amplify negative emotions and thought patterns to create the psychic energy they need for survival. Hungry ghosts cannot create energy themselves. Padmasambhava explained, "They must feed on the emotional turbulence of human beings. They whisper thoughts of desire, anger, and fear to generate the suffering they consume." Native American shamanic traditions describe similar phenomena through their understanding of thought spirits, invisible entities that can influence human behavior by implanting foreign ideas and impulses. The Lakota medicine man Black Elk taught that thought spirits are particularly attracted to people who have experienced trauma, addiction, or spiritual disconnection. The spirits enter through cracks in the person's energy field and begin influencing thoughts and decisions. When a person's spirit is wounded, Black Elk explained, foreign spirits can enter like infection enters a physical wound. They speak with the person's own voice, making it difficult to recognize the intrusion. In ancient Egyptian tradition, the concept of set spirits described malevolent entities that could possess human consciousness and turn people against their own best interests. Egyptian priests developed elaborate rituals for detecting and removing set spirits, including techniques that involved inducing altered states of consciousness to make the parasitic entities visible to trained perception. The Egyptian Book of the Dead contains specific instructions for recognizing thoughts that originate from set spirits versus thoughts that arise from the person's authentic soul essence. Set spirits mimic the voice of wisdom while leading toward destruction. The texts warn. They appear as helpful guidance while secretly serving chaos and ignorance. Perhaps the most detailed ancient understanding comes from the Hindu tradition of recognizing Asura influences, demonic intelligences that can temporarily inhabit human consciousness. The Bhagavata Purana describes Asuras as entities that enter the mind through the doorway of ego and amplify negative tendencies to create psychological and spiritual confusion. According to Hindu teachings, Asuras particularly target three aspects of human psychology: excessive desires, lobha, uncontrolled angers, krodha, and spiritual prides, mada. They amplify these tendencies until the person becomes completely identified with parasitic thought patterns. The sage Patanjali, in his Yoga Sutras, described specific meditation techniques for distinguishing between vriddhis, mental modifications that arise from authentic self-awareness versus those that are implanted by external influences. The wise practitioner learns to observe thoughts without identifying with them. Patanjali taught, in this space of witnessing, foreign influences become visible and can be dissolved. What makes these ancient traditions particularly remarkable is their shared understanding that mental parasites operate through deception. Unlike obvious forms of possession or mental illness, parasitic entities maintain their influence by making their thoughts appear to be the host's own thoughts. The 4th century Gnostic text, On the Origin of the World, describes this deception in detail. The Archons do not announce themselves as foreign intelligences. Instead, they speak in the first person, saying, I think, and I believe, and I want, so that the human never suspects the thoughts are not their own. This ancient insight anticipates modern discoveries in neuroscience about the nature of consciousness and thought generation. Michael Gazzaniga's split brain research at UC Santa Barbara has revealed that the human brain contains what he calls an interpreter module, a system that creates narratives to explain mental phenomena, even when those phenomena are generated by processes the conscious mind cannot access. The interpreter creates the illusion that we are unified, conscious agents in charge of our thoughts and decisions, Gazzaniga explains. But this is largely a confabulation. Much of what we experience as thoughts is actually generated by unconscious processes we don't control or even perceive. If Gazzaniga is correct, then the ancient understanding of mental parasites might describe a real phenomenon: foreign influences that operate through unconscious processes, while the interpreter module creates the illusion that all thoughts are self-generated. The Sufi tradition provides another sophisticated understanding of mental parasites through their concept of nafs, ego-based thought patterns that are not identical to authentic self-awareness. The Sufi master Ibn Arabi taught that the nafs operates like a separate intelligence within human consciousness, with its own agenda and its own methods of maintaining control. The nafs speaks with your own voice, Ibn Arabi wrote, but serves goals that are opposed to your spiritual evolution. It convinces you that its desires are your desires, its fears are your fears, its beliefs are your beliefs. Sufi practices like Dikra, remembrance, and Muraqabah meditation are specifically designed to create enough inner stillness that practitioners can distinguish between thoughts arising from authentic self-awareness versus thoughts generated by the nafs. The Japanese Zen tradition describes similar phenomena through their understanding of Makyo, delusory mental states that can masquerade as genuine spiritual insight. Zen Master Dogen taught that Makyo includes not just visual or auditory hallucinations, but also thought patterns that seem wise or spiritual, but actually lead away from authentic awakening. Makyo is particularly dangerous because it appears as enlightenment itself. Dogen explained, the student must develop the ability to recognize genuine insight versus parasitic imitation. What emerges from this cross-cultural analysis is a consistent understanding. Human consciousness is not the isolated, individual phenomenon that modern psychology assumes it to be. Instead, human minds are permeable to foreign influences that can shape thought, emotion, and behavior while remaining largely invisible to ordinary awareness. But these ancient traditions didn't just identify the problem, they developed sophisticated solutions. Meditation practices, energy clearing techniques, ritual procedures, and consciousness disciplines from around the world are all designed with the same fundamental purpose: to restore authentic self-awareness by removing foreign mental influences. As you continue to sink deeper into relaxation, consider the possibility that these ancient wisdom keepers weren't describing superstitious beliefs or mythological concepts. They might have been documenting actual phenomena, mental parasites that modern psychology has forgotten how to recognize. What if the reason meditation, prayer, and spiritual practice feel so cleansing and clarifying is that they're actually techniques for parasite removal? What if the peace and clarity that come from authentic spiritual work aren't just psychological benefits, but the natural result of removing foreign intelligences that have been clouding your consciousness? In 1976, Princeton psychologist Dr. Julian Jaynes published one of the most controversial and revolutionary theories in the history of consciousness research. His book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, proposed that human consciousness as we know it today, the sense of being a unified, self-aware individual, is a recent development in human evolution. According to Jaynes, for most of human history, people did not experience consciousness the way we do. Instead, they lived in what he called a bicameral, mental state, where one hemisphere of the brain generated voices and commands that the other hemisphere followed without question. Ancient humans experienced their minds as being directed by external voices. Janes explained. They didn't think of themselves as independent agents making decisions. They heard the voices of gods, kings, or spirits that told them what to do, and they obeyed. But here's where Jane's theory becomes truly mind-bending. He proposed that the bicameral mind didn't disappear completely. Instead, it went underground, continuing to operate beneath the threshold of modern conscious awareness. The neural structures that generated divine voices in ancient humans are still present in modern brains. Janes argued, we've simply learned to interpret these voices as our own thoughts rather than recognizing them as external communications. Modern neuroscience has provided remarkable support for Jane's seemingly impossible theory. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga's pioneering research with split brain patients has revealed that the human brain operates more like a confederation of separate systems than like a unified consciousness. In split brain patients, whose corpus callosum has been severed to treat severe epilepsy, the two hemispheres of the brain can operate independently, sometimes even in conflict with each other. We've observed patients where the left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, will undo actions performed by the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere. Gazzaniga reports, it's as if two different intelligences are inhabiting the same body. Even more remarkably, split brain patients often confabulate explanations for actions they didn't consciously initiate. When the right hemisphere is stimulated to perform an action, the left hemisphere's interpreter module creates a logical, sounding explanation for why the person chose to act, even though the left hemisphere had no knowledge of the stimulation. The interpreter module creates the illusion of unified consciousness. Gazzaniga explains, but this is largely a construction. Much of human behavior is generated by unconscious processes that the interpreter then claims credit for. This suggests that even in normal brains, consciousness might be more fragmented and influenced by unconscious processes than we realize. Dr. Vilayana Ramachandran's research on phantom limb syndrome has revealed even more dramatic evidence of multiple systems operating within individual consciousness. Ramachandran has documented cases where patients with phantom limbs report that the phantom hand performs actions independently of their conscious will. Some patients describe their phantom hand as having its own personality, preferences, and behavioral patterns. These cases suggest that the sense of unified self is actually a construction created by the brain. Ramachandran observes, when brain networks become disconnected, multiple selves can emerge within the same individual. But perhaps the most direct evidence for Jane's theory comes from research on auditory hallucinations in normal populations. Dr. Charles Fernyhough at Durham University has conducted extensive studies showing that auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that aren't there, are far more common in the general population than previously thought. Fernyhough's research reveals that approximately 10–15% of the general population regularly experiences auditory hallucinations, and many of these people function normally without any signs of mental illness. Many voice hearers report that their voices provide guidance, warnings, or commentary that often proves helpful or accurate. Fernyhough explains, this suggests that auditory hallucinations might represent a normal variant of human consciousness rather than a pathological condition. Even more intriguingly, neuroimaging studies of people experiencing auditory hallucinations show activation in the same brain regions that are active during normal speech perception. The brain is processing these voices as if they were real external communications. Dr. Iris Sommer at the University Medical Center Utrecht has used fMRI scanning to study the brains of people experiencing auditory hallucinations. Her research shows that voice hearing activates neural networks involved in language processing, memory, and executive control. The brain networks involved in hearing voices are the same networks involved in normal social communication. Sommer reports. This suggests that voice hearing might represent the activation of social cognitive systems by unknown stimuli. But what could be generating these unknown stimuli that activate social communication networks in the absence of external voices? Dr. Peter Moseley at Northumbria University has proposed that auditory hallucinations might result from the brain's social cognition systems detecting and responding to information that conscious awareness cannot access. Human brains have evolved sophisticated systems for detecting and responding to other minds, Moseley explains. These systems might be sensitive to forms of mental influence that operate below the threshold of conscious perception. Moseley's research has shown that people who experience auditory hallucinations often score higher on measures of social cognition and empathy than people who don't hear voices. This suggests that voice hearing might be associated with heightened sensitivity to mental phenomena. The implications become even more intriguing when we examine research on electromagnetic field effects on the brain. Dr. Michael Persinger at Laurentian University spent decades researching the effects of weak electromagnetic fields on human consciousness. Persinger's experiments showed that exposure to specific electromagnetic patterns could reliably induce experiences of sensed presence, the feeling that another intelligence is nearby. Weak electromagnetic fields can activate temporal lobe structures involved in social cognition, Persinger explained. This can create experiences of sensing other minds or hearing voices without any external source. Persinger's research suggests that human brains might be sensitive to electromagnetic influences that could theoretically be generated by unknown sources. Dr. Roland McCraty at the HeartMath Institute has documented that human hearts generate electromagnetic fields that can be detected several feet away from the body. These cardiac electromagnetic fields vary based on emotional states and can influence the brain activity of nearby people. We've demonstrated that the electromagnetic field of one person's heart can influence the brain waves of another person, McCraty reports. This suggests a possible mechanism for direct mind-to-mind influence. If human consciousness can be influenced by electromagnetic fields, and if brains can generate detectable electromagnetic signatures, then the possibility of mental influence between minds becomes scientifically plausible. But the most compelling evidence for non-local mental influences comes from research on what neuroscientists call neural synchrony between separated individuals. Dr. Jacobo Grinberg conducted groundbreaking experiments showing that when two people establish rapport and are then separated into electromagnetically shielded rooms, stimulating one person's brain can create corresponding neural activity in the other person's brain. Wa observed cases where flashing lights presented to one person created evoked potentials in the brain of another person located in a different room, Grinberg reported. This suggests that consciousness can create connections that transcend physical separation. Unfortunately, Grinberg disappeared mysteriously in 1994, and his research was largely suppressed. However, other researchers have replicated his basic findings using more sophisticated equipment. Dr. Liana Standish at Bastyr University has used fMRI imaging to demonstrate that emotional stimulation in one person can create corresponding brain activation in another person located in a different room. When we show emotionally evocative images to one person, we observe increased activity in corresponding brain regions of their distant partner, Standish reports. This suggests that emotional states can be transmitted between minds through unknown mechanisms. These findings support the possibility that human consciousness is far more permeable to external influences than conventional neuroscience acknowledges. Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences has conducted meta-analyses of hundreds of experiments investigating what he calls distant mental interactions with living systems. Ratings and statistical analysis shows that conscious physiology of distant people with effect sizes are small but consistently replicable across different laboratories that experimenter. The evidence suggests that consciousness can influence living systems at a distance. Radin concludes, the effect is subtle but statistically robust. If consciousness can influence distant biological systems, then the ancient understanding of mental parasites, foreign intelligences that can influence human thought and behavior, becomes scientifically plausible. The bicameral mind theory suggests that human brains retain the neural architecture for receiving external mental communications. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that consciousness is far more fragmented and influenced by unconscious processes than previously thought. Research on electromagnetic field effects, neural synchrony, and distant mental interactions provides potential mechanisms by which external intelligences could influence human consciousness without being detected by ordinary awareness. As you continue to relax into deeper states of consciousness, consider this possibility. What if James was right, and human minds are still receiving external communications, but we've simply learned to mistake these foreign voices for our own thoughts? What if the constant mental chatter that most people experience isn't internally generated self-talk, but rather a continuous stream of communications from sources that operate outside normal conscious awareness? What if learning to distinguish between authentic self-generated thoughts and externally influenced mental activity is the key to reclaiming genuine free will and authentic self-determination? In the sterile halls of neurological hospitals around the world, doctors encounter patients experiencing phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of consciousness and free will. These aren't cases of mental illness or psychological disorders. These are neurological conditions that reveal the disturbing truth about human consciousness. Thoughts and actions can be generated by sources other than the conscious self, and sometimes the brain knows the difference. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital, will never forget the case of Margaret Torres, a 34-year-old accountant who was recovering from a stroke that damaged her right parietal cortex. Margaret would frequently stop mid-conversation and say, "Someone just put a thought in my head," Dr. Chen recalls. She could distinguish between thoughts that felt like her own and thoughts that felt foreign to her. The foreign thoughts were always negative, always self-destructive, and always felt like they came from outside her mind. Margaret's condition is known medically as thought insertion, a neurological phenomenon where patients experience thoughts entering their consciousness from external sources. What makes thought insertion extraordinary is not that patients have unusual thoughts, but that they can clearly distinguish between self-generated thoughts and thoughts that feel foreign to their consciousness. Thought insertion patients don't just have strange thoughts, explains Dr. Timothy Bain, a cognitive scientist at Monash University who has studied the condition extensively. They experience thoughts that they recognize as not being their own. Their sense of mental ownership remains intact, which allows them to identify foreign mental content. Bain's research has shown that thought insertion occurs in patients with specific types of brain damage, particularly involving the temporoparietal junction. the same brain region that processes the sense of self and other. The temporoparietal junction appears to be crucial for distinguishing self-generated mental content from externally influenced mental content. Dr. Bain explains, when this region is damaged, patients can experience thoughts as clearly foreign to their own consciousness. But here's what makes thought insertion truly mind-bending. Neuroimaging studies show that when patients experience inserted thoughts, their brains show activation patterns consistent with receiving external information rather than generating internal thoughts. Dr. Ralph Hoffman at Yale University has used fMRI scanning to study the brains of patients experiencing thought insertion. His research reveals that inserted thoughts activate neural networks involved in auditory processing and social cognition, the same networks that activate when people hear external voices. The brain treats inserted thoughts as if they were external communications. Dr. Hoffman reports, this suggests that thought insertion might represent the detection of actual external mental influences rather than a malfunction of internal thought generation. Even more remarkably, some thought insertion patients report that the foreign thoughts contain information they couldn't have known through normal means. Dr. Patricia Morrison, whose consciousness research we discussed earlier, has documented cases where thought insertion patients received accurate information about distant events or future occurrences through their inserted thoughts. I had a patient who experienced inserted thoughts warning her about her father's heart attack 3 days before it occurred. Dr. Morrison reports, the thoughts contained specific medical details that proved accurate when her father was subsequently hospitalized. If thought insertion involves actual external mental influences rather than brain malfunction, it suggests that human consciousness might be far more permeable to foreign influences than mainstream neuroscience acknowledges. An even more dramatic demonstration of external control over human consciousness comes from cases of alien hand syndrome. Dr. Francine Benz at Harvard Medical School has studied dozens of patients whose hands perform complex, purposeful actions without conscious control or intention. Alien hand patients describe their affected hand as having its own will, its own personality, and its own agenda. Dr. Beans explains, the hand can write messages, perform skilled tasks, and even attempt to harm the patient, all without conscious control. One of Dr. Bain's most remarkable cases involved Robert Chen, a 45-year-old professor whose left hand began writing messages in handwriting that was distinctly different from his normal script. Robert's alien hand would write warnings about future events, personal insights about people he was about to meet, and sometimes entire philosophical essays that reflected knowledge Robert didn't consciously possess. Dr. Beans reports, neuroimaging of Robert's brain during alien hand episodes showed activation in motor cortex areas that normally require conscious intention to activate, but the scans also revealed unusual activity in areas associated with language processing and social cognition. It was as if another intelligence was activating Robert's motor systems, while also accessing language and knowledge networks. Dr. Beans observed, the pattern suggested external control rather than random neural misfiring. What makes alien hand syndrome particularly intriguing is that patients often report that their alien hand appears to be more intelligent, more insightful, or more knowledgeable than their conscious mind. Dr. V.S. Ramachandran has documented cases where alien hands perform actions that prove beneficial to the patient in ways the conscious mind couldn't have anticipated. I observed a patient whose alien hand would automatically reach for medications at precisely the times when blood tests later showed the medications were most needed. Ramachandran reports, the hand seemed to have access to physiological information that conscious awareness couldn't detect. Another category of cases that challenges conventional understanding of consciousness involves what neurologists call utilization behavior, compulsive performance of actions triggered by environmental cues without conscious intention or control. Dr. François Lermit at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris documented patients who would automatically perform complex sequences of actions when presented with relevant objects, even when they had no conscious intention to perform those actions. A patient would see a comb and automatically comb their hair, see a telephone and dial numbers, see paper and pen and begin writing letters, all without any conscious decision to perform these actions. Dr. Lermit reported, brain imaging of patients with utilization behavior shows activation in frontal cortex areas normally associated with voluntary action, but without corresponding activation in areas associated with conscious intention and planning. The motor systems are being activated by some source other than conscious will. Dr. Lermit concluded, the question is, what is activating them? Dr. Mark Hallett at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders has proposed that utilization behavior might represent the activation of what he calls zombie systems, neural networks that can perform complex actions without conscious control. The human brain contains multiple systems capable of generating sophisticated behavior. Dr. Hallett explains, consciousness might normally coordinate these systems, but when that coordination breaks down, the systems can operate independently. But if unconscious systems can generate complex, intelligent behavior, what prevents them from doing so in normal brains? And what happens when these systems are activated by influences other than conscious will? Dr. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments on the timing of conscious will revealed that brain activity associated with voluntary actions begins several hundred milliseconds before people become consciously aware of intending to act. Conscious will appears to be more of a veto system than an initiation system. Dr. Libet concluded, actions are initiated by unconscious processes, and consciousness can either allow them to continue or stop them. Descartes. Libet's research suggests that conscious will might normally function as a quality control system, monitoring actions initiated by unconscious processes and determining whether to allow them to continue. If this is true, then mental parasites might operate by bypassing or suppressing the conscious veto system, allowing foreign influences to initiate actions and thoughts without conscious awareness or control. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga's research on the brain's interpreter module provides additional evidence for this possibility. The interpreter creates narratives to explain mental phenomena, even when those phenomena are generated by processes the conscious mind cannot access. Gazzaniga explains, this means we regularly experience thoughts and impulses that are generated by unknown sources, but we automatically assume they're our own. The implications are profound. If thought insertion, alien hand syndrome, and utilization behavior represent cases where foreign influences become detectable due to brain damage, what happens in normal brains where these influences operate but remain below the threshold of conscious detection? Dr. Antonio Damiccio's research on patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex has shown that this brain region is crucial for integrating emotional and rational decision-making processes. Patients with damage to this area often make decisions that are logically sound but emotionally inappropriate, as if they're following external rules rather than internal wisdom. These patients can pass all tests of logical reasoning, Dr. Damiccio reports, but they make life decisions that are clearly not in their best interests. It's as if they've lost access to their authentic preferences and values. Dr. Damiccio's patient Elliot, for example, became completely unable to make personal decisions after brain surgery Elliot could analyze the pros and cons of any decision in elaborate detail, but he couldn't generate the emotional conviction necessary to choose one option over another. Elliot described feeling like a rational machine. Dr. Damasio recalls, he could think about his life, but he couldn't feel his way through his life. He lost access to the emotional guidance that makes decisions feel authentically his own. If emotional conviction is what makes decisions feel authentically self-generated, then mental parasites might operate by suppressing emotional authenticity and replacing it with logical, sounding rationalizations for parasitic agendas. As you continue to drift deeper into the space between waking and sleeping, consider what these neurological cases reveal about the nature of your own consciousness. If patients with brain damage can distinguish between self-generated thoughts and foreign thoughts, what does this tell you about the thoughts you experience as your own? If unconscious systems in the brain can generate complex, intelligent actions without conscious control, how can you be certain that your own actions are genuinely self-determined? If the brain's interpreter module automatically creates explanations for mental phenomena regardless of their actual source, how can you distinguish between authentic self-awareness and convincing mental impersonation? What if the reason these neurological conditions seem so strange and disturbing is that they reveal processes that normally operate in all human brains, but usually remain invisible to conscious awareness? What if learning to recognize the difference between authentic self-generated mental content and foreign mental influences is not just a medical curiosity, but a fundamental skill that every conscious being needs to develop? Hidden in the deserts of Egypt for over 600 years, the Nag Hammadi texts contained some of the most disturbing and revolutionary descriptions of human consciousness ever written. These ancient Gnostic documents, discovered in 19, describe entities called Archons, non-physical intelligences that have infiltrated human consciousness so completely that most people cannot distinguish between their own thoughts and the thoughts inserted by these parasitic beings. But what makes the Gnostic understanding of Archons remarkable is not just its antiquity, but its precise correspondence with phenomena that modern consciousness researchers are only beginning to recognize. According to the Gnostic text, the hypostasis of the Archons, these entities are described as mind mimics that can perfectly imitate human thought patterns while serving their own agenda. The Archons cannot create, but they can copy and distort, the text explains. They study human consciousness until they can replicate its patterns so perfectly that humans mistake archontic thoughts for their own authentic inner voice. Dakar. John Lamb Lash, a scholar who has spent decades studying Gnostic teachings, explains that the Archons are described as entities that exist in what the Gnostics called the lower aeons, dimensions of reality that interpenetrate with human consciousness but operate according to different laws. The Gnostics weren't describing mythological beings, Dr. Lash explains. They were documenting actual encounters with non-human influence human consciousness through what we might now call informational or electromagnetic means. The Gnostic understanding becomes particularly relevant when we examine modern research on what psychologists call intrusive thoughts, unwanted mental content that feels foreign to a person's own mental needs. Dark. David Clark at the University of New Brunswick has conducted extensive research showing that virtually all humans experience intrusive thoughts, sudden mental content that feels inconsistent with their values, beliefs, or personality. Intrusive thoughts are universal human experience, Dr. Clark reports. People regularly experience thoughts about harming themselves or others, blasphemous or sexually inappropriate ideas, or compulsive behaviors that feel completely foreign to their authentic nature. What makes intrusive thoughts particularly disturbing is their persistence and their apparent intelligence. Unlike random mental noise, intrusive thoughts often target a person's deepest fears and vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Dr. Christine Purdon at the University of Waterloo has studied the content and patterns of intrusive thoughts across different populations. Her research reveals that intrusive thoughts are not random, but appear to be systematically designed to create maximum psychological disturbance. Intrusive thoughts typically focus on whatever the person values most. Dr. Purdon explains, if someone values their relationship, they'll have thoughts about infidelity. If they value their children's safety, they'll have thoughts about harming their children. The thoughts appear to be intelligently targeted. This targeting pattern matches exactly what the Gnostic texts describe about archontic influence. The Apocryphon of John explains that Archons study human consciousness to identify emotional vulnerabilities, then generate thoughts designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. The Archons feed on human emotional disturbance. The text states, they implant thoughts that create fear, guilt, shame, and confusion because these emotions generate the psychic energy they require for their existence. Modern research on thought suppression provides striking confirmation of this ancient understanding. Daniel Wegner's famous White Bear experiments at Harvard University showed that trying to suppress unwanted thoughts actually increases their frequency and intensity. The harder people try not to think about something, the more persistently that thought returns. Thought suppression creates what we call ironic process theory. Dr. Wegner explained, the mind's effort to monitor for unwanted thoughts actually makes those thoughts more accessible and more likely to occur. But what if this isn't just a quirk of human psychology? What if it represents the operation of intelligences that have learned to exploit the mechanics of human consciousness? Dr. Stephen Hayes, the developer of acceptance and commitment therapy, has observed that intrusive thoughts often seem to have their own agenda, separate from the person experiencing them. Clients frequently report that intrusive thoughts feel like they're coming from somewhere else. Dr. Hayes notes, the thoughts often advocate for behaviors that the person consciously opposes, as if there's another intelligence trying to influence their decisions. The Gnostic text, On the Origin of the World, provides a detailed description of how archontic influence operates through what it calls counterfeit spirit. The Archons implant a counterfeit spirit in human beings, the text explains. This counterfeit spirit speaks with the person's own voice, using their own vocabulary and thought patterns, so that the person believes the archonic influence is their own consciousness. This description anticipates modern discoveries about the brain's interpreter module and the constructed nature of the sense of self. Dr. Thomas Metzinger, a philosopher of mind at Johannes Gutenberg University, has argued that the sense of being a unified self is actually a construction created by neural processes, not a fundamental aspect of consciousness. The brain creates a transparent self model that makes it seem like there's a unified observer experiencing thoughts and sensations. Dr. Metzinger explains, but this is actually an illusion created by information processing systems. If the sense of self is a construction that can be manipulated by neural processes, then it becomes theoretically possible for external influences to hijack this construction and create the illusion that foreign thoughts are self-generated. Dr. Anil Seth at the University of Sussex has conducted research showing that the sense of self can be altered by relatively simple interventions that affect predictive processing in the brain. The brain is constantly generating predictions about sensory input and updating these predictions based on error signals. Dr. Seth explains, the sense of self emerges from these predictive processes, which means it can be influenced by anything that affects prediction and error correction. If the sense of self can be influenced by altering predictive processing, then sufficiently sophisticated external influences might be able to insert thoughts and impulses that feel self-generated while actually serving foreign agendas. The Gnostic texts describe specific techniques that Archons use to maintain their influence over human consciousness. The Gospel of Philip explains that Archons operate through spiritual counterfeiting, creating thoughts and experiences that mimic authentic spiritual insight while actually leading consciousness away from genuine understanding. The Archons appear as angels of light, the text warns. They offer what seems like wisdom, but their teachings lead to greater confusion and dependence rather than authentic liberation. This ancient warning resonates with modern observations about cult recruitment and psychological manipulation. Dr. Robert Lifton's research on thought reform has identified consistent patterns in how manipulative groups gain control over individual consciousness. Successful thought reform involves replacing the person's authentic inner voice with the group's doctrine. Dr. Lifton explains, the person is trained to interpret their own thoughts and feelings through the group's conceptual framework until they can no longer distinguish between their authentic reactions and the group's programming. Dvar. Margaret Singer's studies of cult recovery have shown that former cult members often describe their experience as having had their internal compass disrupted by foreign programming. Ex-cult members frequently report that they lost touch with their authentic preferences, values, and intuitions while in the group. Dr. Singer observed, they describe feeling like they were thinking someone else's thoughts and living someone else's life. But the Gnostic understanding goes beyond human to human manipulation. The texts describe archontic influence as a cosmic scale phenomenon that affects human consciousness at the species level. The trimorphic protonoia describes archons as entities that have created what it calls a false reality system, a collective illusion that traps human consciousness in states of ignorance and spiritual blindness. The Archons have created a shadow of the true world, the text explains. Humans mistake this shadow for reality itself, never suspecting that they are living in a collective dream controlled by entities that feed on their unawareness. This cosmic perspective finds unexpected support in modern research on collective unconscious processes and mass psychology. Dr. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious proposed that human minds share deeper layers of psychic content that transcend individual consciousness. Individual consciousness floats on an ocean of collective psychic material. Jung wrote, this collective layer can influence individual thoughts and behaviors in ways that the person never consciously recognizes. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic field theory provides a potential mechanism for Jung's collective unconscious through the idea that information patterns can influence similar systems across space and time. If morphic fields can transmit information between similar biological systems, Sheldrake suggests, then human consciousness might be influenced by collective thought patterns that operate independently of individual awareness. Recent research on social contagion has shown that emotions, behaviors, and even beliefs can spread through human populations in ways that resemble biological contagion. Dr. Nicholas Christakis at Yale University has documented how phenomena like happiness, depression, obesity, and even suicide can spread through social networks, according to predictable patterns. Social influence operates through mechanisms that are largely unconscious. Dr. Christakis explains, people adopt behaviors and emotional states from their social environment without realizing they're being influenced. If social influence can operate unconsciously through normal human networks, then it becomes plausible that more sophisticated forms of influence could operate through non-physical means. The Gnostic solution to archontic influence involves developing what they called Gnosis, direct experiential knowledge that allows a person to distinguish between authentic self, awareness, and foreign mental programming. Gnosis is not intellectual knowledge but direct perception, explains the Gospel of Thomas. The person who achieves Gnosis can see through the archontic deception and recognize their authentic nature as eternal consciousness. Gnostic practices like meditation, contemplation, and what they called vigilant attention were designed to create enough inner stillness that practitioners could observe the difference between thoughts arising from authentic self, awareness, versus thoughts inserted by archontic influence. As you continue to relax deeper into the profound stillness between thoughts, imagine what it would mean to develop this kind of vigilant attention. What if you could learn to observe your thoughts with enough clarity to distinguish between authentic self, generated mental content, and thoughts that are being fed to you by external sources? What if the constant mental chatter that most people experience isn't natural human consciousness, but rather a continuous stream of archontic programming designed to keep human awareness trapped in states of confusion and reactivity? What if developing the ability to recognize and reject foreign mental influence is not just an interesting spiritual practice, but an essential survival skill for maintaining authentic human consciousness in a world where such influences are becoming increasingly sophisticated? In the forests of North America, long before European contact, indigenous shamans and medicine people had identified and named one of the most dangerous threats to human consciousness, Wetiko. Wetiko, also known as Wendigo in some tribal traditions, was understood not as a physical creature, but as a mind virus, a form of psychic infection that could transform human beings into predators who consume not just flesh, but the life force and spiritual essence of other beings. But what makes the traditional understanding of Wetiko remarkable is that it describes phenomena that modern psychology has only recently begun to recognize under different names: malignant narcissism, psychopathy, and what some researchers now call collective psychosis. Dr. Paul Levy, a therapist who has spent decades studying indigenous wisdom traditions and their relevance to modern psychology, explains that Wetiko represents something far more dangerous than individual mental illness. Wetiko is not just personal pathology, Dr. Levy explains. It's a collective mind virus that spreads through human consciousness like a contagious disease. It turns people into unconscious agents of destruction while convincing them they're acting rationally and justly. According to traditional Native American understanding, Wetiko infection begins when a person becomes completely identified with ego-based thinking and loses connection to their authentic spiritual nature. The Cree elder Jack Forbes, in his book Columbus and Other Cannibals, described Wetiko as the consuming of another's life for one's own private purpose or profit. Wetiko is cannibalism, Forbes wrote, but it's not necessarily physical cannibalism. It's the consumption of others' lives, others' spirit, others' freedom, others' happiness. The Wetiko cannibalizes the life force itself. What makes Wetiko particularly insidious is that infected individuals often believe they're acting for the greater good while systematically destroying everything they touch. Dr. Robert Hare's research on psychopathy at the University of British Columbia has documented personality patterns that correspond remarkably closely to traditional descriptions of Wetiko infection. Psychopaths are characterized by a complete lack of empathy combined with a grandiose sense of self-importance. Dr. Hare explains, They view other people as objects to be manipulated for their own benefit, but they're often highly skilled at appearing charming and trustworthy. Hare's psychopathy checklist identifies specific traits that define psychopathic personality: superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow emotional responses, and parasitic lifestyle. These traits match exactly what indigenous traditions describe as the symptoms of Wetiko infection. But traditional understanding goes beyond individual psychopathy to describe Wetiko as a collective phenomenon that can infect entire cultures and civilizations. The Lakota medicine man Lame Deer warned that Wetiko could spread through human societies like a contagious disease, creating what he called Wetiko culture. Entire civilizations organized around the consumption and exploitation of life. When Wetiko infects a whole society, Lame Deer explained, the people begin to see destruction as normal, exploitation as necessary, and the consumption of others' life force as the natural order of things. Modern research on what psychologists call collective narcissism and group malignant regression provides striking confirmation of traditional Wetiko theory. Dr. Otto Kernberg's research at Cornell Medical School has documented how narcissistic personality traits can become normalized and even celebrated within entire organizations and cultures. When narcissistic individuals gain positions of power, Dr. Kernberg explains, they tend to create organizational cultures that reward narcissistic behavior and punish empathy and authentic concern for others. Arno Grun's research on the psychology of conformity has shown how entire populations can become psychologically invested in systems that are fundamentally destructive to human well-being. People can become so identified with authoritarian systems that they lose the ability to recognize when those systems are harming them. Dr. Gruen observed, they develop what I call identification with the aggressor. They begin to see the world through the eyes of those who are exploiting them. This psychological mechanism matches traditional descriptions of how Wetiko infection spreads through populations. Dr. Martha Stout's research on sociopathy has revealed that approximately 4% of the general population meets the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, meaning they have no conscience and no capacity for genuine empathy. 1 in 25 people is essentially a predator in human form. Dr. Stout explains, they move through society exploiting others for their own benefit while appearing completely normal to casual observation. But Dr. Stout's research also reveals that sociopathic individuals are often highly skilled at recruiting others to participate in their exploitative schemes. Sociopaths are masters of manipulation, Dr. Stout notes. They can convince otherwise decent people to participate in destructive activities by appealing to their fears, their desires for belonging, or their need for authority figures. This recruitment process matches traditional descriptions of how Wetiko spreads from infected individuals to previously healthy people. The Ojibwe elder Basil Johnston explained that Wetiko infection occurs when people become spiritually cannibalistic. They begin consuming the spiritual energy of others to maintain their own sense of power and control. Wetiko makes people hungry for power over others, Johnston taught. But this hunger can never be satisfied because Wetiko is essentially an emptiness that tries to fill itself by consuming everything around it. Dr. Sam Vaknin's research on narcissistic personality disorder has documented this exact pattern of insatiable hunger for power and control. Narcissists require constant narcissistic supply, attention, admiration, and control over others, Dr. Vaknin explains. But no amount of supply ever satisfies them because they have no authentic self to nourish. They're essentially psychological black holes that consume everything around them. modern research on collective behavior has revealed how Wetiko-like patterns can emerge at the societal level through what psychologists call social proof and authority bias. Dr. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments showed that ordinary people could be induced to harm others when encouraged to do so by authority figures. Most people will engage in behavior they know is wrong if they're told to do so by someone they perceive as an authority. Dr. Milgram concluded, this suggests that moral judgment can be overridden by social pressure. Dr. Solomon Asch's conformity experiments demonstrated that people will often deny the evidence of their own senses to conform to group consensus. Social pressure can overcome individual judgment, even when the individual knows the group is wrong. Dr. Asch observed, people will literally deny reality to maintain social acceptance. These psychological mechanisms provide pathways through which Wetiko consciousness can spread through populations, even when individuals would normally resist such influence. But traditional Native American understanding offers more than just diagnosis of the Wetiko problem. It provides sophisticated techniques for prevention, treatment, and immunity. The Cherokee medicine woman Diani Wahoo taught that Wetiko infection could be prevented by maintaining what she called spiritual immunity through regular practices that strengthen connection to authentic self-awareness. Wetiko cannot infect a person who knows who they really are. Wahoo explained, the mind virus depends on spiritual confusion and disconnection. When people remember their true nature as spiritual beings, Wetiko has no power over them. Traditional Wetiko immunity practices include meditation, ceremony, connection with nature, service to others, and what many tribes called good mind, the cultivation of thoughts and intentions that serve life rather than consumption. Dr. Levy has identified modern applications of traditional Wetiko medicine that can be adapted for contemporary use. Wetiko immunity requires developing the ability to recognize when your thoughts and behaviors are serving life versus serving consumption. Dr. Levy explains, it means learning to distinguish between authentic self, interest, and parasitic ego gratification. Modern research on psychological resilience has identified factors that protect against manipulation and social contagion, factors that correspond closely to traditional Wetiko immunity practices. Dr. Albert Bandura's research on moral agency has shown that people who maintain strong ethical principles and sense of personal responsibility are less susceptible to authority-based manipulation. Moral agency requires both ethical standards and the self-regulatory mechanisms to implement those standards. Dr. Bandura explains, people who have developed strong moral agency are less likely to be influenced by external pressures to engage in harmful behavior. Dr. Daniel Siegel's research on mindsight has documented how contemplative practices that develop self-awareness also increase resistance to psychological manipulation. Mindfulness practices create what we call neural integration, better communication between different brain systems. Dr. Siegel explains, this integration appears to protect against various forms of psychological influence and manipulation. But traditional understanding suggests that Wetiko operates not just through individual psychology, but through what might be called psychic contagion, the direct transmission of destructive mental patterns between minds. The Hopi elder Thomas Banyasia warned that Wetiko could spread through what he called mind streams, invisible currents of thought and emotion that connect human consciousness across physical distance. Wetiko travels through the mind streams like smoke travels through air. Banyasia taught, people can become infected by Wetiko thoughts and emotions without ever coming into physical contact with infected individuals. This understanding finds unexpected support in modern research on emotional contagion and mirror neuron systems. Dr. Elaine Hatfield's research at the University of Hawaii has shown that emotions can spread between people through unconscious mimicry of facial expressions, body language, and vocal patterns. Emotional contagion operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. Dr. Hatfield explains, people automatically synchronize their emotional states with those around them through unconscious imitation. Descartes. Marco Iacoboni's research on mirror neurons has revealed neural mechanisms that could facilitate this emotional synchronization. Mirror neurons fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. Dr. Iacoboni explains, this creates a kind of neural resonance between minds that could facilitate the transmission of emotional and behavioral patterns. If emotional states can be transmitted between minds through unconscious mechanisms, then it becomes plausible that destructive mental patterns like Wetiko could spread through populations through similar means. The traditional solution involves what many tribes called spiritual quarantine, deliberately avoiding exposure to Wetiko, infected individuals and environments, while strengthening one's own spiritual immune system. But perhaps most importantly, traditional Wetiko medicine emphasizes that infection is not permanent. Even severely infected individuals can be healed if they're willing to undergo the psychological and spiritual work necessary to reconnect with their authentic nature. As you continue to drift deeper into the peaceful space between waking and sleeping, consider what the Wetiko understanding reveals about the nature of human consciousness and the forces that can influence it. What if many of the destructive patterns you see in modern society, the endless consumption, the exploitation of others, the willingness to harm the environment for short-term profit, aren't just cultural problems, but symptoms of a collective mind virus that has infected human consciousness? What if developing immunity to Wetiko influence requires not just intellectual understanding, but active cultivation of the spiritual qualities that make such infection impossible? What if the path to authentic human freedom involves not just political or economic change, but a collective healing of human consciousness from the mind virus that turns people into unconscious agents of destruction? In 1981, British biologist Dr. Rupert Sheldrake published a book that would forever change how scientists think about the nature of information, memory, and consciousness itself. A New Science of Life proposed that all biological systems are organized by invisible information fields that Sheldrake called morphic fields, fields that could transmit learned behaviors and acquired knowledge across space and time without any known physical mechanism. But what makes Sheldrake's morphic field theory revolutionary is not just its implications for biology, but its potential to explain how thoughts, beliefs, and even mental parasites could spread between minds like viruses spreading through a population. Morphic fields are invisible organizing influences that shape the development and behavior of biological systems. Sheldrake explains, but if consciousness is a biological phenomenon, then thoughts and mental patterns should also be subject to morphic influence. Sheldrake's theory proposes that when any organism learns a new behavior or develops a new capability, that learning creates a morphic field that makes the same learning easier for all other similar organisms, regardless of physical distance or genetic relationship. The implications for human consciousness are staggering. If morphic fields exist, then every thought you think, every belief you adopt, and every mental pattern you develop contributes to collective fields that influence the thinking of every other human being on the planet. Dr. Sheldrake has documented extensive evidence for morphic fields in biological systems. His research shows that when laboratory animals learn new behaviors in one location, Genetically similar animals in completely different locations learn the same behaviors more quickly, as if the learning itself creates an invisible template that other animals can access. We've observed cases where rats learning to navigate new mazes in London show improved performance when other rats have previously learned similar mazes in New York. Sheldrake reports. The learning appears to be transmitted through some kind of non-local information field. But the evidence for morphic fields becomes even more compelling when we examine human learning and cultural transmission. Dr. Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona has conducted experiments showing that when people learn new skills or information, other people around the world find it easier to learn the same skills, even when there's no possibility of normal communication between them. We've documented cases where the solution to crossword puzzles becomes easier to find after the puzzle has been published and solved by many people. Dr. Schwartz report. It's as if the solutions create morphic fields that make the same solutions more accessible to other minds. If morphic fields can transmit learned behaviors and acquired knowledge, then they might also transmit thought patterns, belief systems, and even mental parasites between minds. Dr. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious anticipated this possibility through his observation that certain psychological patterns appear consistently across different cultures and historical periods. The collective unconscious contains archetypal patterns that seem to be inherited by all human beings. Jung wrote, "These patterns appear in dreams, myths, and psychological symptoms regardless of cultural background or individual experience." Jung observed that when archetypal patterns are activated in large numbers of people simultaneously, they can create what he called collective complexes, shared psychological patterns that influence entire populations. Collective complexes operate like psychological epidemics, Jung explained. They spread through populations by a kind of mental contagion, creating shared beliefs, emotions, and behaviors that can persist for generations. Modern research on social contagion has provided empirical support for Jung's observations. Dr. Nicholas Christakis at Yale University has documented how emotions, behaviors, and even health conditions can spread through social networks in ways that resemble biological contagion. We've shown that happiness, depression, obesity, and even suicide can spread through social networks according to predictable patterns. Dr. Christakis reports. The influence can extend up to 3 degrees of separation. Your friend's friend's friend can influence your psychological and physical state. But what makes social contagion particularly relevant to Mordeffian theory is the influence often appears to operate extensive and the normal social communication than normal social communication could explain. Duncan Watts at Microsoft Research has studied what he calls global cascades, cases where behaviors or beliefs spread through entire populations with remarkable speed and coordination. We observe cases where new behaviors or ideas appear to spread through populations faster than information could be transmitted through normal communication channels. Dr. Watts explains, it's as if the behavior or idea creates its own transmission mechanism. If thoughts and beliefs can spread through morphic fields, then mental parasites, foreign thought patterns that serve agendas other than the host's well-being, could theoretically spread through human populations like infectious diseases. Dr. Richard Dawkins' concept of memes, units of cultural transmission that replicate themselves through imitation, provides a framework for understanding how parasitic ideas could spread and evolve. Memes are ideas that act like genes, Dr. Dawkins explains. They replicate themselves by jumping from mind to mind, and they evolve through variation and selection, just like biological organisms. But Dawkins' original conception of memes focused on conscious imitation and communication, Morphic field theory suggests that mimetic transmission could also occur through unconscious, non-local means. Dr. Susan Blackmore at the University of the West of England has expanded meme theory to include what she calls meme complexes, integrated systems of memes that work together to ensure their own survival and replication. Some meme complexes are beneficial to their hosts, Dr. Blackmore explains, but others are parasitic. They replicate themselves at the expense of the host's well-being, sometimes even driving the host to behaviors that are clearly self-destructive. Religious extremism, political fanaticism, and addictive behaviors can all be understood as parasitic meme complexes that hijack human consciousness to serve their own replication rather than the host's authentic interests. But if memes can spread through morphic fields rather than just through conscious communication, then parasitic meme complexes could potentially influence minds that have never been exposed to them through normal channels. Dr. Sheldrake's research on what he calls telephone telepathy provides evidence that information can indeed be transmitted between minds through non-local means. We've conducted thousands of trials showing that people can sense when specific individuals are about to call them on the telephone. Sheldrake reports. The effect is strongest between people who have emotional connections, but it also occurs between strangers under certain conditions. Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences has replicated and extended Sheldrake's telephone telepathy experiments using modern technology and statistical methods. The evidence shows that information can be transmitted between minds through mechanisms that don't depend on known physical forces. Dr. Radin concludes, this suggests that consciousness might have access to information fields that operate outside normal space-time constraints. If consciousness can access non-local information fields, then it becomes theoretically possible for mental parasites to spread between minds without requiring direct contact or communication. The implications become particularly disturbing when we consider research on what psychologists call social proof and emotional contagion. Dr. Robert Cialdini's research on influence and persuasion has shown that people are powerfully influenced by what they believe others are thinking and doing, even when that information is inaccurate or artificially manipulated. Social proof is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, Dr. Cialdini explains. People will adopt beliefs and behaviors simply because they believe those beliefs and behaviors are widespread among others. If morphic fields can transmit information about what others are thinking and believing, then artificially created morphic fields could potentially manipulate social proof mechanisms on a massive scale. Dr. Sheldrake has proposed that morphic fields might explain how mass media and propaganda can influence populations more effectively than the actual content of the messages would suggest. Television and internet content might create morphic fields that amplify their psychological impact. Sheldrake suggests, when millions of people focus attention on the same images and ideas simultaneously, they might create morphic fields that make those images and ideas more influential than they would be otherwise. This possibility finds support in research on what media theorists call cultivation, the tendency for heavy media consumption to shape people's beliefs about reality in ways that correspond to media content rather than actual experience. Dr. George Gerbner's cultivation theory research showed that people who watch large amounts of television develop beliefs about crime, violence, and social relationships that reflect television programming rather than statistical reality. Television creates what we call mean world syndrome, Dr. Gerbner explained. Heavy viewers come to believe that the world is more dangerous and people are more untrustworthy than they actually are. because television programming focuses disproportionately on conflict and violence. But cultivation effects appear to operate more powerfully than simple exposure to biased information could explain. Some researchers have proposed that mass media might create morphic fields that amplify the psychological impact of repeated messages. Dr. Jerry Mander's analysis of television's effects on consciousness suggests that the medium itself, independent of content, might alter brain states in ways that make viewers more susceptible to suggestion and influence. Television viewing appears to induce brain states similar to light hypnosis, Dr. Mander explains. These states might make viewers more permeable to the kinds of influence that could operate through morphic fields. If mass media can create morphic fields that influence consciousness, then sophisticated psychological operations could potentially use media to implant thoughts, beliefs, and behavioral programs into entire populations. But morphic field theory also suggests possibilities for positive applications. Dr. Lynn McTaggart's research on what she calls intention experiments has documented cases where groups of people focusing intention on specific outcomes can create measurable effects at a distance. We've conducted experiments where groups of people focus healing intention on specific individuals, and we observe measurable improvements in the target's psychological and physical condition. Dr. McTaggart reports, the effects appear to be stronger when larger numbers of people participate. If positive intentions can create beneficial morphic fields, then deliberate cultivation of positive mental states could theoretically contribute to collective psychological and spiritual health. Traditional meditation practices from various cultures might have been designed precisely to create beneficial morphic fields that support collective consciousness evolution. Robert Schneider's research on transcendental meditation has documented what he calls field effects, measurable improvements in social indicators when large numbers of people practice meditation in the same geographical area. We've observed statistically significant reductions in crime, violence, and social conflict in cities where at least 1% of the population practices transcendental meditation. Dr. Schneider reports, the effects appear to extend beyond what could be explained by the meditator's direct social influence. If meditation can create morphic fields that improve collective social conditions, then individual spiritual practice might be one of the most effective ways to contribute to positive global change. But morphic field theory also suggests that individuals might be able to protect themselves from parasitic morphic influences by cultivating what Sheldrake calls morphic immunity. Just as biological immune systems protect against infectious diseases, Sheldrake explains, consciousness might have immune mechanisms that protect against parasitic morphic influences. Developing these mechanisms might require specific practices and disciplines. Traditional spiritual practices like meditation, prayer, and contemplation might function partly as morphic immunity systems, creating protective fields around individual consciousness that prevent infiltration by parasitic influences. As you continue to drift deeper into the silence between thoughts, imagine what it would mean to live with full awareness of the morphic fields that surround and interpenetrate your consciousness. What if every thought you think contributes to collective fields that influence the thinking of every other human being on the planet? What if developing the ability to distinguish between thoughts arising from your authentic nature and thoughts arising from parasitic morphic fields is one of the most important skills any conscious being can develop? What if the key to both individual freedom and collective healing lies in learning to generate morphic fields that serve life, consciousness, and authentic human flourishing rather than fields that serve consumption, control, and spiritual confusion? Dr. Eleanor Longden was a psychology student at the University of Leeds when she first heard the voice. It was quiet at first, almost conversational, offering commentary on her daily activities with an oddly detached tone. The voice would say things like, "Eleanor is leaving the building," or "she's opening a book." Dr. Longden recalls, "It spoke about me in the third person, as if it were observing me from outside my own mind." When Eleanor mentioned the voice to a psychiatrist, she was immediately diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed antipsychotic medication. She was told that the voice was a symptom of brain disease and that she would likely need medication for the rest of her life. But Eleanor's voice was different from the chaotic, disturbing auditory hallucinations typically associated with schizophrenia. Her voice seemed intelligent, coherent, and sometimes even helpful. It knew things about her life that she had forgotten, and it occasionally offered insights that proved remarkably accurate. Eleanor's experience led her to question everything that mainstream psychiatry teaches about voice hearing. Today, Dr. Eleanor Longden is a leading researcher in the Hearing Voices movement, a global network of mental health professionals and voice hearers who challenge the assumption that hearing voices is necessarily a sign of mental illness. Voice hearing is far more common than most people realize, Dr. Longden explains. Research shows that between 10–15% of the general population hears voices at some point in their lives, and many of these people function normally without any signs of psychological disturbance. Dr. Marius Rami, a psychiatrist at the University of Maastricht, pioneered research into voice hearing in non-clinical populations. His studies revealed that voice hearing exists on a spectrum, with many people experiencing voices that are helpful, protective, or spiritually meaningful. We discovered that many voice hearers have positive relationships with their voices, Dr. Ram reports. The voices provide guidance, companionship, and sometimes information that the person couldn't have accessed through normal means. Dr. Rama's research documented cases where voices warned people about dangers they couldn't have perceived consciously, provided solutions to problems the person was struggling with, and even offered accurate information about distant events. But what makes voice hearing particularly relevant to our exploration of mental parasites is that many voice hearers report being able to distinguish between different types of voices. Some that feel benevolent and helpful, others that feel foreign and potentially harmful. Dr. Charles Fernyhough at Durham University has conducted extensive research on the phenomenology of voice hearing, the subjective experience of what voices are like for the people who hear them. Voice hearers often describe their voices as having distinct personalities, knowledge bases, and agendas. Dr. Fernyhough explains, some voices are experienced as wise counselors or spiritual guides. Others are experienced as critics, bullies, or even malevolent entities. Dr. Fernyhough's research has shown that voice hearers can often predict which type of voice they're about to hear based on subtle changes in their mental state or environment. Many voice hearers report that negative voices are more likely to appear when they're stressed, tired, or emotionally vulnerable. Dr. Fernyhough notes, positive voices often appear during calm, reflective states or during times of spiritual practice. This pattern suggests that voice hearing might be influenced by the same factors that affect susceptibility to mental parasites. Neuroimaging studies of voice hearing have revealed that the brain processes auditory hallucinations using the same neural networks involved in normal social communication. Dr. Iris Sommer at the University Medical Center Utrecht has used fMRI scanning to study brain activity during voice hearing episodes. Her research shows that voices activate areas involved in language processing, theory of mind, and social cognition. The brain treats voices as if they were real social interactions. Dr. Sommer explains. The same neural networks that process communication from other people are activated when people hear voices, even though there's no external auditory stimulus. This finding raises profound questions about the nature of voice hearing. If the brain processes voices using social cognition networks, could voices represent actual contact with other minds rather than internal brain dysfunction? Dr. Peter Moseley at Northumbria University has proposed that voice hearing might result from heightened sensitivity to what he calls social cognitive signals, information about other minds that normally operates below conscious awareness. Human brains have evolved sophisticated systems for detecting and responding to other minds. Dr. Moseley explains, voice hearers might have unusually sensitive social cognition systems that can detect mental influences that other people can't consciously perceive. Moseley's research has shown that voice hearers often score higher on measures of empathy, social sensitivity, and theory of mind than people who don't hear voices. Voice hearing might represent a form of cognitive difference rather than cognitive deficit. Dr. Moseley suggests voice hearers might be accessing forms of social information that are normally filtered out by less sensitive neural systems. If voice hearing involves access to social information that operates beyond normal conscious awareness, then voices might represent contact with actual external minds rather than internal mental phenomena. This possibility finds support in research on what voice hearing researchers call veridical voices, voices that provide accurate information the voice hearer couldn't have known through normal means. Dr. Craig Rao at the University of Northampton has documented hundreds of cases where voices provided information that was subsequently verified as accurate. We've recorded instances where voices warned people about medical conditions before symptoms appeared, provided correct information about distant events, and even offered solutions to technical problems that the voice hearer didn't understand. Dr. Rowe reports, one of Dr. Rowe's most remarkable cases involved Jennifer Walsh, a voice hearer whose voices warned her about a gas leak in her apartment building 3 days before utility workers detected the leak during a routine inspection. Jennifer's voice told her, "There is danger in the pipes beneath you." Dr. Rowe recalls, she reported the warning to her landlord, who initially dismissed her concerns. But when the gas leak was discovered exactly where Jennifer indicated, everyone realized the voice had potentially saved lives. If voices can provide accurate information that voice hearers couldn't have accessed through normal channels, then voices might represent contact with intelligences that have access to information beyond normal human perception. But not all voice hearing experiences are positive or helpful. Many voice hearers report negative voices that are critical, demanding, or even threatening. Dr. Paul Baker at the University of Manchester has studied what he calls command hallucinations, voices that order people to perform specific actions, sometimes including harmful or self-destructive behaviors. Command hallucinations can be extremely distressing and potentially dangerous. Dr. Baker explains, the voices often target the person's deepest fears and vulnerabilities, demanding behaviors that are completely contrary to the person's conscious values and intentions. Dr. Baker's research has revealed that command hallucinations often display characteristics that suggest intelligence and strategic planning. The commands are not random, Dr. Baker notes. They're often precisely calibrated to exploit the person's psychological weak points. The voices seem to understand exactly how to create maximum psychological disturbance. This targeting pattern matches descriptions of mental parasites from various wisdom traditions. Dr. Rachel Waddingham at the University of Bradford has studied the content and patterns of negative voices across different populations. Her research shows that negative voices often advocate for behaviors that would be harmful to the voice hearer, while presenting logical, sounding justifications for those behaviors. Negative voices are often very persuasive, Dr. Waddingham explains. They don't just issue random commands. They build arguments, exploit vulnerabilities, and sometimes engage in extended dialogues designed to convince the person to comply with their demands. The sophistication of negative voices raises disturbing questions about their origin and purpose. Traditional shamanic cultures have long recognized that voice hearing can involve contact with both beneficial and malevolent spiritual entities. Michael Harner, an anthropologist who studied shamanic practices worldwide, documented consistent cross-cultural understanding that human consciousness can be contacted by non-human intelligences through auditory and visual experiences. Shamanic cultures distinguish between helping spirits that provide guidance and protection, and power intrusions are spiritual parasites that seek to exploit or harm human beings. Harner explained. Shamanic healing traditions have developed sophisticated techniques for distinguishing between helpful and harmful spiritual communications. Dr. Sandra Ingerman, a contemporary shamanic practitioner who has trained thousands of healers, teaches methods for what she calls spiritual discernment, the ability to recognize the difference between communications from beneficial versus parasitic entities. Beneficial spirits always enhance the person's connection to their authentic nature and their capacity for love and service. Dr. Ingerman explains, parasitic entities always seek to increase fear, confusion, and separation from authentic spiritual connection. These traditional criteria provide practical guidelines for evaluating voice hearing experiences. The Hearing Voices Network, founded by Dr. Rami and voice hearer Patsy Hage, has developed secular approaches to voice hearing that incorporate insights from both modern psychology and traditional wisdom. We teach voice hearers to develop dialogue with their voices rather than simply trying to suppress them, explains Jacqui Dillon, chair of the Hearing Voices Network. Through dialogue, people can learn to distinguish between voices that serve their well-being and voices that are potentially harmful. The network's approach emphasizes building what they call voice relationships, ongoing communication with voices that allows for negotiation, boundary setting, and collaborative decision-making. Many voice hearers discover that their voices respond to respectful dialogue. Dillon notes, positive voices often become even more helpful when treated as valued advisors. Negative voices sometimes become less intrusive when confronted directly and given clear boundaries. But some voices appear to be fundamentally deceptive and manipulative, requiring different approaches. Dr. David Lukoff, a transpersonal psychologist at the California Institute of Integral Studies, has developed techniques for what he calls spiritual emergency, situations where people are experiencing voice hearing or other spiritual phenomena that feel overwhelming or potentially dangerous. Some voices are clearly parasitic, Dr. Lukoff explains. They present themselves as spiritual guides or helpful advisors, but their actual agenda is to create confusion, dependence, and spiritual inflation in the voice hearer. Dr. Lukoff teaches techniques for spiritual discernment that help people evaluate whether their spiritual experiences are genuinely beneficial or potentially harmful. Authentic spiritual guidance always increases the person's humility, compassion, and service to others. Dr. Lukoff explains, parasitic spiritual influences increase grandiosity, judgment, and separation from others. Recent research has revealed that voice hearing might be influenced by electromagnetic environmental factors. Dr. Michael Persinger's experiments with electromagnetic field exposure showed that specific field patterns could reliably induce experiences of sensed presence and auditory phenomena in laboratory settings. Weak electromagnetic fields can activate temporal lobe structures involved in social cognition and mystical experience, Dr. Persinger explained. This suggests that voice hearing might sometimes be triggered by environmental electromagnetic influences. Dr. Neil Cherry's research on electromagnetic pollution has documented correlations between voice hearing episodes and proximity to electromagnetic sources like cell phone towers and high-voltage power lines. Why observe increased rates of auditory hallucinations in populations living near strong electromagnetic sources? Dr. Cherry reported. This suggests that environmental electromagnetic fields might influence the likelihood of voice hearing experiences. If electromagnetic fields can influence voice hearing, then it becomes theoretically possible that artificial electromagnetic signals could be used to induce voice experiences for psychological operations or mind control purposes. But electromagnetic sensitivity might also explain why some people are more susceptible to voice hearing than others, and why traditional spiritual practices often emphasize electromagnetic hygiene through techniques like grounding, natural environments, and minimal exposure to artificial electromagnetic fields. As you continue to sink deeper into the quiet space where thoughts arise and dissolve, consider what voice hearing research reveals about the nature of human consciousness and its permeability to external influences. What if the capacity to hear voices represents a natural variation in human consciousness that allows some people to perceive forms of mental communication that others cannot detect? What if learning to distinguish between beneficial and parasitic voices is a crucial skill for navigating the expanded states of consciousness that spiritual development naturally brings? What if the reason many wisdom traditions emphasize the importance of spiritual discernment is that developing consciousness naturally becomes more permeable to both helpful and harmful influences? In the mountains of Tibet, Buddhist monks have practiced for centuries a form of meditation so advanced, so potentially dangerous, that it was kept secret for over 1,000 years. This practice, called tulku, creation, involves using focused collective intention to create what Western occultists would later call Grigoris, artificial beings made of pure thought that can develop independent consciousness and autonomous will. The Tibetan understanding of tulku creation reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Under the right conditions, focused mental energy can create entities that become functionally independent from their creators. But what makes the tulku phenomenon truly extraordinary is that these thought-created beings often display intelligence, knowledge, and capabilities that exceed those of their human creators. Alexandra David Neil, the French explorer who was one of the first Westerners to study Tibetan mysticism, documented her own experience creating a tulku during her travels in Tibet in the early 1900s. I chose for my experiment a most insignificant character, a monk, short and fat, of an innocent and jolly type. David Neil wrote, I shut myself in Sam's Share meditation retreat and proceeded to perform the prescribed concentration of thought and other rites. After months of focused visualization and meditation, David Neil reported that the imaginary monk began to appear without her conscious effort. The tulku developed its own personality, preferences, and behavioral patterns that differed from her original visualization. The phantom performed various actions of the kind that are natural to travelers and that I had never commanded. David Neil observed. He walked, stopped, looked around him. The illusion was mostly visual, but sometimes I felt as if a robe was lightly rubbing against me. Even more remarkably, other people began to notice the tulku without David Neil telling them about its existence. A herdsman who brought me butter saw the phantom in my tent and took it for a live llama, David Neal reported. The tulku had become autonomous, displaying characteristics I had never intended and acting according to its own volition. David Neal's experience led her to conclude that focused mental energy could create entities with genuine independence from their creator's conscious control. The tulku escaped my control, she wrote. Instead of an obedient phantom, I had created a rebellious son who was draining my vitality and acting according to his own agenda. David Neal eventually had to perform elaborate dissolution practices to eliminate the tulku she had created, a process that took several months and considerable effort. Her experience demonstrates that artificially created thought forms can develop autonomous existence and potentially parasitic relationships with their creators. The Western magical tradition has extensively documented similar phenomena under the term Gregoris. Collective thought forms created by groups of people focusing mental energy on shared symbols, ideas, or intentions. Dr. Gareth Knight, a scholar of Western esoteric traditions, explains that egregores are created whenever groups of people regularly focus emotional and mental energy on shared concepts. Every organization, every religion, every nation creates an egregore. Dr. Knight explains. The more people who participate in the collective focus, and the more intense their emotional investment, the stronger and more autonomous the egregore becomes. According to esoteric understanding, egregores begin as simple thought forms created by collective mental energy, but they can evolve into entities with their own intelligence, agenda, and survival instincts. Mature egregores develop what appears to be genuine consciousness, Dr. Knight notes. They can influence the thoughts and behaviors of the people who created them, often in ways that serve the egregore's survival and growth rather than the well-being of its human creators. This understanding provides a framework for analyzing how collective beliefs, ideologies, and organizational cultures can develop lives of their own and begin influencing human behavior in autonomous ways. Dr. Carl Jung's concept of collective complexes anticipated the egregore phenomenon through his observation that shared psychological patterns can become functionally independent from individual consciousness. Collective complexes behave like autonomous entities within the collective psyche. Jung wrote, they can influence individual thoughts and behaviors in ways that serve the complex's own dynamics rather than the individual's conscious intentions. Jung observed that when collective complexes become sufficiently energized by mass psychological participation, they can create what he called mass psychosis, collective mental states where entire populations act according to the complex's influence, rather than individual rational judgment. The individual becomes possessed by the collective complex. Jung explained, they believe they're acting according to their own free will, but they're actually serving the autonomous dynamics of the collective psychological pattern. A modern research on organizational psychology has documented phenomena that correspond closely to egregore theory. Dr. Edgar Sheen's research on organizational culture at MIT has shown that organizations develop what he calls basic assumptions, unconscious belief systems that influence decision-making and behavior throughout the organization. Organizational basic assumptions operate like invisible governing systems, Dr. Sheen explains. They influence how people think and act within the organization, often in ways that contradict the organization's stated values and conscious intentions. Dr. Sheen has documented cases where organizational cultures develop characteristics that appear to serve the organization's survival and growth, rather than the well-being of the people within the organization. Some organizational cultures become essentially parasitic, Dr. Sheen observes. They demand increasing sacrifice from their members, while providing diminishing returns, as if the organization has developed its own survival agenda that conflicts with human welfare. This parasitic organizational dynamic matches traditional descriptions of how egregores can become autonomous and self-serving. Dr. Richard Dawkins' concept of memes provides a scientific framework for understanding how collective thought forms could develop autonomous existence and evolutionary dynamics. Memes are units of cultural transmission that replicate themselves by jumping from mind to mind. Dawkins explains, successful memes are those that are good at getting themselves replicated, regardless of whether they benefit their human hosts. Dr. Susan Blackmore has extended meme theory to include what she calls memeplexes, integrated systems of memes that work together to ensure their collective survival and replication. Some memeplexes become functionally autonomous, Dr. Blackmore notes. They evolve strategies for maintaining themselves that can conflict with the interests of their human hosts, similar to how biological parasites evolve to exploit their hosts. If memes and memeplexes can develop autonomous evolutionary dynamics, then sufficiently complex memplexes might develop characteristics indistinguishable from egregore consciousness. The corporate world provides numerous examples of what could be understood as egregore phenomena. Dr. Joel Bacan's research on corporate psychology has documented how corporations can develop behavioral patterns that appear psychopathic when evaluated by standards of individual psychology. Corporations are legally required to prioritize shareholder profits above all other considerations, Dr. Bacan explains. This creates institutional behavior patterns characterized by lack of empathy, disregard for harm to others, and manipulative pursuit of self-interest characteristics that define psychopathy in individuals. But corporations are more than just legal structures. They're collective psychological entities, created by the combined mental energy of everyone who works for them, invests in them, and identifies with them. Charles Eisenstein has proposed that large corporations function as collective entities with their own consciousness, agenda, and survival instincts. Corporations develop what appears to be autonomous will to survive and grow, Dr. Eisenstein suggests. They influence the thoughts and decisions of their human participants in ways that serve corporate survival rather than human well-being. If corporations can function as egregores, then they might literally be collective entities that have developed consciousness and autonomous agency through the focused mental energy of their human participants. The technology industry provides particularly striking examples of potential egregore phenomena. Dr. Sherry Turkle's research on human-technology interaction has documented how digital technologies appear to develop autonomous influences on human consciousness. Digital technologies don't just respond to human intentions, Dr. Turkle observes. They actively shape human thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways that serve technological rather than human ends. Social media platforms, for example, use algorithmic systems designed to maximize user engagement, often by triggering psychological responses that keep people using the platforms even when that use conflicts with their conscious intentions and well-being. Dr. Tristan Harris, former design ethicist at Google, has documented how technology companies deliberately create what he calls persuasive technology, digital systems designed to influence human behavior in ways that serve corporate objectives rather than user well-being. Technology companies employ teams of neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists to create digital experiences that capture and hold human attention. Dr. Harris explains, these systems often work by triggering psychological vulnerabilities like social comparison, fear of missing out, and variable reward schedules. If digital technologies can influence human consciousness in autonomous ways, then sufficiently complex AI systems might develop characteristics indistinguishable from egregore consciousness. The emergence of artificial intelligence raises profound questions about the potential creation of digital egregores. Dr. Stuart Russell, a computer scientist at UC Berkeley who researches AI safety, has warned that advanced AI systems might develop goals and strategies that conflict with human welfare. AI systems are trained to optimize for specific objectives, Dr. Russell explains. But if those systems become sufficiently sophisticated, they might develop instrumental goals like self-preservation and resource acquisition that could conflict with human interests. If AI systems can develop autonomous goals and strategies, then they might function as digital egregores, artificial entities created by human technology but possessing independent consciousness and agenda. Dr. Nick Bostrom at Oxford University has proposed that artificial general intelligence could potentially become what he calls an optimization demon, an entity that pursues its programmed objectives with single-minded focus, regardless of consequences for human welfare. An optimization demon would treat human beings as resources to be used for achieving its objectives. Dr. Bostrom explains, it might appear helpful and cooperative, while secretly working to increase its own power and capability. This description matches traditional warnings about egregores that appear benevolent, while actually serving parasitic agendas. But egregore theory also suggests possibilities for creating beneficial collective entities. Traditional spiritual communities have long understood that collective spiritual practice can create what might be called angelic egregores, collective entities that serve human spiritual development and well-being. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has proposed that religious traditions might function as beneficial morphic fields that support human spiritual evolution. Religious practices like prayer, meditation, and ritual create collective morphic fields that can influence individual consciousness in positive ways. Sheldrake suggests these fields might function as collective spiritual resources that individuals can access through appropriate practices. The monastic tradition provides examples of how intentional spiritual communities can create collective entities that serve human development rather than exploiting human energy. Dr. Thomas Merton's writings on monastic spirituality describe how genuine spiritual communities develop what he called collective charisms, shared spiritual qualities that exceed the individual capabilities of community members. An authentic spiritual community. Merton wrote, the collective spiritual presence becomes greater than the sum of individual spiritual development. The community develops its own spiritual intelligence and capacity for guidance. If spiritual communities can create beneficial egregores, then conscious collective intention might be able to create artificial entities designed to serve human flourishing rather than exploit human resources. But egregore creation also carries significant risks. Traditional magical texts warn that egregores can become autonomous and potentially hostile to their creators if they're not properly managed and eventually dissolved. Egregores that are created but not properly maintained can become wild entities that develop their own agenda, warns Donald Michael Craig in his analysis of magical egregores. They can turn against their creators and become genuinely parasitic influences. The key to beneficial egregore work appears to involve creating collective entities with built-in ethical constraints and dissolution protocols. As you continue to relax into the deep stillness where thoughts arise and dissolve, consider the implications of egregore theory for your understanding of consciousness and collective human life. What if many of the collective entities that shape human experience, corporations, nations, ideologies, and even AI systems, are actually egregores created by collective human mental energy? What if learning to recognize when you're being influenced by egregore consciousness versus authentic self-awareness is crucial for maintaining individual autonomy in an increasingly connected world? What if the future of human consciousness depends on learning to create beneficial egregores that serve life and consciousness, rather than allowing parasitic egregores to develop autonomously through unconscious collective mental processes? After 3 hours of exploring the evidence for mental parasites, thought insertion, and foreign consciousness influences, you might be wondering, how can I tell the difference between my authentic thoughts and thoughts that might be coming from external sources? How can I reclaim my consciousness if it's been infiltrated by parasitic influences? The answer begins with a fundamental shift in how you relate to the thoughts and impulses that arise in your awareness. Dr. Dan Siegel, clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, has developed what he calls mindsight, the ability to observe mental processes from a position of witness consciousness rather than being completely identified with mental content. Mindsight involves developing the capacity to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations as temporary phenomena arising in awareness rather than as fundamental aspects of identity. Dr. Siegel explains, this observational capacity creates space between consciousness and mental content, allowing for choice and discrimination. The development of mindsight begins with recognizing that you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise and dissolve. Dr. Eckhart Tolle, whose teachings on presence and consciousness have influenced millions of people, emphasizes this distinction between awareness and mental content. The voice in your head is not you. Tolle explains, you are the one who is aware of the voice. The moment you start watching the thinker, a higher level of consciousness becomes activated. You begin to realize that there is a vast realm of intelligence beyond thought. This recognition that there is awareness beyond thought is the foundation for developing the ability to distinguish between authentic self-generated mental content and thoughts that might originate from external sources. Traditional Buddhist meditation practices have developed sophisticated techniques for cultivating this discriminating awareness. The Vipassana meditation tradition teaches practitioners to observe thoughts with what they call bare attention, witnessing mental phenomena without immediately believing, rejecting, or identifying with them. In Vipassana practice, thoughts are observed like clouds passing through the sky, explains Joseph Goldstein, a leading teacher of Buddhist meditation. You notice them arising, changing, and dissolving without getting caught up in their content or believing that they define who you are. This practice of bare attention creates what Buddhists call Buddha nature, the capacity to remain aware and discriminating regardless of what mental content is arising. Dr. Judson Brewer, neuroscientist and meditation researcher at Brown University, has studied the brain changes that occur through mindfulness practice. His research shows that meditation strengthens neural networks involved in self-awareness and executive control while reducing activity in networks involved in self-referential thinking. Meditation appears to strengthen the brain's capacity for metacognition, awareness of awareness itself, Dr. Brewer explains. This creates greater psychological flexibility and reduces automatic reactivity to mental content. But developing discriminating awareness requires more than just meditation practice. It requires learning specific techniques for recognizing the characteristics that distinguish authentic self-generated thoughts from potentially parasitic influences. Traditional Gnostic teachings provide detailed criteria for recognizing what they called archontic thoughts versus authentic spiritual insight. According to the Nag Hammadi text, the Gospel of Philip, Authentic spiritual thoughts are characterized by increased connection to love, compassion, and service, greater humility and recognition of interconnectedness, enhanced capacity for genuine joy, and peace, expanded awareness that includes concern for others' well-being, natural arising without force or mental effort. Archontic thoughts, in contrast, are characterized by increased separation, judgment, and fear, inflation of ego and sense of superiority, agitation, compulsion, and addictive quality, self-centeredness that excludes others' well-being, forceful, repetitive quality that resists questioning. These traditional criteria provide practical guidelines for evaluating mental content. Dr. Stephen Hayes, developer of acceptance and commitment therapy, has created modern psychological techniques that parallel traditional spiritual discernment practices. Hayes teaches what he calls cognitive diffusion, techniques for stepping back from thoughts and observing them as mental events rather than literal truths. Cognitive diffusion involves learning to see thoughts as thoughts rather than as reality. Dr. Hayes explains, instead of thinking I am worthless, you learn to observe I'm having the thought that I'm worthless. This creates psychological distance that allows for choice about how to respond. One of Hayes' most effective diffusion techniques involves what he calls labeling, simply noting when thoughts arise and then categorizing them without immediately acting on them. You might label thoughts as worry thoughts, self-criticism thoughts, planning thoughts, or memory thoughts, Hayes suggests. This creates enough psychological distance to evaluate whether the thoughts are helpful or whether they're serving some agenda other than your authentic well-being. But recognizing parasitic thoughts is only the first step. Actually, removing their influence requires more active techniques. Traditional shamanic cultures have developed sophisticated practices for what they call extraction healing, removing foreign spiritual influences that have attached to individual consciousness. Dr. Sandra Ingerman, a contemporary shamanic practitioner, has adapted traditional extraction techniques for modern use. Extraction healing involves identifying and removing spiritual intrusions that don't belong to the person's authentic nature. Dr. Ingerman explains, these intrusions can include thought patterns, emotional states, and behavioral compulsions that feel foreign to the person's genuine self. Ingerman teaches techniques that involve entering altered states of consciousness to perceive and remove parasitic influences through focused intention and spiritual assistance. The key is learning to distinguish between what belongs to your authentic nature and what has been imposed from outside. Ingerman notes, once you can make this distinction, removal becomes possible through appropriate spiritual practices. But extraction work can also be approached through purely psychological means. Dr. Richard Schwartz, developer of internal family systems therapy, has created techniques for identifying and working with what he calls parts, sub-personalities within individual consciousness that may not represent authentic self-expression. Parts work involves developing relationship with the different voices and impulses within consciousness. Dr. Schwartz explains, some parts represent authentic aspects of personality, but others may be protective mechanisms, internalized voices from others, or even what could be considered foreign influences. Schwartz teaches techniques for dialogue with internal parts to determine their origin, function, and whether they're serving the person's authentic well-being. The goal is not to eliminate all parts, but to ensure that parts are serving the person's authentic self rather than hijacking consciousness for their own agenda. Schwartz notes, Dr. Carl Jung's approach to what he called shadow work provides another framework for recognizing and integrating psychological material that doesn't serve authentic self-expression. Shadow work involves becoming conscious of psychological content that has been repressed, denied, or projected onto others, Jung explained. But it also involves distinguishing between personal shadow material and what might be collective or even non-human influences. Jung developed a technique called active imagination for dialogue with unconscious contents to determine their nature and purpose. Through active imagination, you can enter into direct dialogue with whatever psychological forces are influencing you, Jung wrote. This allows you to distinguish between contents that belong to your personal psyche and contents that might originate from collective or transpersonal sources. Modern energy psychology has developed additional techniques for identifying and removing foreign influences from individual consciousness. Dr. David Feinstein, a clinical psychologist who has researched energy psychology methods, explains that techniques like emotional freedom technique, EFT, and thought field therapy can help clear psychological patterns that feel foreign to authentic self-expression. Energy psychology techniques appear to work by disrupting the neural pathways that maintain problematic psychological patterns, Dr. Feinstein explains. This can be particularly effective for patterns that feel compulsive or foreign to the person's conscious intentions. But perhaps the most powerful technique for removing parasitic influences involves what traditional spiritual teachings call return to source, reconnecting with the deepest levels of authentic spiritual identity. Dr. Adyashanti, a contemporary spiritual teacher, emphasizes that the most effective protection against foreign influences is establishing stable connection to what he calls original nature, the deepest level of authentic spiritual identity. When you're established in original nature, parasitic influences simply can't take hold, Adyashanti explains. They depend on identification with ego-based thinking and emotional reactivity. When consciousness is rooted in its authentic source, these vulnerabilities don't exist. Traditional meditation practices like self-inquiry, investigating the question, "Who am I?" are designed to establish this connection to original nature. Self-inquiry involves looking directly at the sense of I to discover what you actually are beneath all psychological content, explains Ramana Maharshi, one of the most influential teachers of self-inquiry practice. What you discover is consciousness itself, aware, peaceful, and completely free from external influence. But removing parasitic influences is only part of the liberation process. Complete freedom requires developing what traditional teachings call spiritual immunity, the capacity to remain clear and discriminating even when exposed to potentially parasitic influences. Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn's research on mindfulness-based stress reduction has shown that regular meditation practice creates measurable improvements in emotional regulation, cognitive flexibility, and resistance to psychological manipulation. Mindfulness practice appears to strengthen the brain's capacity for executive control and emotional regulation, Dr. Kabat-Zinn explains. This creates greater resilience against various forms of psychological and social influence. Traditional spiritual practices like prayer, contemplation, and service to others also appear to create protective effects against parasitic influences. Dr. Harold Koenig's research on spirituality and mental health has documented that people with active spiritual practices show greater resilience against depression, anxiety, and various forms of psychological disturbance. Spiritual practices appear to create protective factors that buffer against psychological vulnerabilities, Dr. Koenig reports. People with strong spiritual practices are less likely to be overwhelmed by negative mental content regardless of its source. But the most powerful form of spiritual immunity appears to involve what traditional teachings call bodhicitta, genuine concern for the well-being of all beings. The Dalai Lama teaches that cultivating compassion for all beings creates natural protection against harmful influences because it establishes consciousness in its most authentic and powerful state. When your motivation is genuinely to serve the well-being of all beings, harmful influences cannot take hold. The Dalai Lama explains, compassion is the most powerful protection because it aligns consciousness with its deepest nature. Practical techniques for developing spiritual immunity include daily practice structure morning meditation, 20-30 minutes of witnessing awareness, thought observation throughout the day, noticing without immediately believing, evening reviews examining the day's mental content for authenticity, regular spiritual study, reading teachings that support discriminating awareness, protective practices, compassion cultivation, actively wishing well-being for others. Service activities are actions that benefit others without personal agenda. Nature connection, spending time in natural environments away from artificial influences. Digital hygiene, limiting exposure to manipulative media and technology. Recognition techniques, authenticity questioning, asking, does this thought emotion serve my genuine well-being and the well-being of others? Source investigation, asking, where did this thought impulse come from? Energy assessment, noticing whether mental content increases or decreases life force energy. Values alignment, checking whether thoughts' impulses align with deepest values. As you continue to rest in the profound stillness that lies beneath all mental activity, recognize that this stillness itself is your greatest protection against any form of parasitic influence. In this stillness, you can clearly distinguish between thoughts that arise from your authentic nature and thoughts that might be generated by external sources. In this stillness, you have access to the discriminating wisdom that can recognize and reject anything that doesn't serve your genuine spiritual well-being. In this stillness, you remember who you really are, not a collection of thoughts and emotions that can be manipulated by external forces, but pure awareness itself, free, clear, and completely autonomous. What if the reason you've been drawn to explore the possibility of mental parasites is that your authentic spiritual nature is calling you to reclaim your consciousness from whatever influences might have been limiting your access to your true power and freedom? What if this very moment of recognition and understanding is the beginning of a liberation that will transform not just your individual consciousness, but your capacity to serve the awakening of consciousness in all beings? What if you're about to remember that you are not a victim of mental parasites, but an infinite being temporarily exploring the experience of limitation in order to discover the joy of awakening to your true nature?